point of raising the third one is to illustrate that it was the concern of the inspector, not the concern of the developer to sign up to that.
Just on Part C and the criteria there, before I forget it, frankly, which is perhaps slightly out of order, but I may forget it otherwise. A very minor point, and that's in relation to criterion 7, ensure size and density of pitches plots are in accordance with best practice guidance. Should that be have regard to best practice guidance?
Yes, sir, that's fine. We can make that modification. So I think for now we can probably leave that there.
Councillor Waters.
Thank you, sir. Apologise at the outset because you stated a few minutes ago that you'd got clarity on the provision of the 10 extra pitches.
In the sense that I understood what the council was telling me.
Right. Well, I think I'm going to muddy the waters a bit here, unfortunately.
Oh, good. I do thank you, Councillor Waters.
In terms of the 3 sites, and I'm sure the Travellers Trust will correct me if I'm wrong, James Street, no room at all for expansion. I'm unsure at the Clifton site what actual room there is for expansion there, but it is worthy of note that the Clifton site, and I think this dates back to the 80s when it was run by the Gypsy Council, is actually the best run of the 3 sites. In terms of expansion room at the Osbaldwick site, that was expanded in 2013, as I explained earlier, and in terms of management, it's been a complete and utter disaster, and I'm sure the Travellers Trust will endorse those remarks as to the management of the Osbaldwick site and how undesirable it would be if there was any further expansion of that site. It does worry me, and that's the main reason I'm here today, in that expansion of that site could potentially be tacked on with ST7, depending on how that is resolved. So it's all right taking the money from these commuted sum payments when there isn't actually the space on the local authority sites to provide these pitches. Now, it was a point I made at Planning Committee that certainly for 2 of those commuted sums, the sites would have lent themselves to actually creating 3 gypsy pitches on those sites. And it just seemed as though the council were quite happy to take the money off the developers, because the developers were quite happy to remove that obligation, but there's nowhere to actually deliver those sites. I'll come back on the other points later, but sorry to muddy the waters, Inspector.
So is this one of those cases where the council is sort of operating this policy already?
So it's something that's been applied as an emergent policy in a number of applications that have been determined, and hence why those contributions from York Central, etc., that I've explained to you have been secured.
Yeah, I think I know the answer to this question. Because I was going to ask, you see, why you've taken commuted sums in relation to York Central, Monks Cross and Burbridge Road, which is a point that Councillor Waters was making, because, well, that leads to the question of their viability, potentially, or at least it does in relation to the wording that you have proposed through your main modification. I think the answer to the question is probably that you're applying a policy that is worded differently in this submitted plan rather than the main modification wording. Is that right?
Precisely so. It was more flexible at that point. So the more stringent requirement that I talked through this morning, or slightly a few moments ago, wasn't part of that at that time.
Yeah, so the policy that you've been applying, in effect, offers a kind of pick and choose, doesn't it, in terms of on-site or commuted sum for off-site or providing alternative land. An applicant could do either one of those things and meet the requirements of the policy that you've been applying, but that wouldn't be the case in relation to the policy as you have now proposed. It should be worded where it would be on-site and commuted sums would only be taken where providing on-site would prove to be unviable.
Correct, sir. And for clarity, Mr. Porter, when he undertook his viability appraisal, included these Gypsy and Traveller contributions to ensure that they were taken into account for the purposes of his viability work.
Councillor Waters' other point, which you'll be happy to know doesn't muddy the waters, in the sense that it's a straightforward disagreement, I think, in relation to the ability of the three sites to expand, at least as you see it, in an acceptable way, or whether it's desirable for them to, rather than anything more confusing, hopefully.
Well, the council could probably give us a lot more clarity on this, because it was mentioned that the council's land estate would also be utilised. Now, that's the first I've heard of it or read of it, so whether the council are going to produce a paper that details where in their land estate they're proposing to make this provision.
Yeah, the points that you're making about that, actually, Mr. Henderson, I'm not entirely clear about as well.
So the answer is no. We're not going to put a paper before this inquiry, this examination, which says these are the land holdings. That's the work that's going to be undertaken by the officer who we are recruiting, and that is, in our submission, a realistic and sensible approach.
That's a separate matter, though, isn't it, to the 10 additional pitches in Part A of the policy?
So yes, and we haven't specified which of the three, because we consider it's necessary to have flexibility on those three. Mr. Jones has described the indicative work that's already been undertaken to look at Clifton, the possibility of up to 10 there. You've heard what he said about that. There may be other opportunities on the other sites for a smaller number, so then it would be a blend of the three, and hence why we've worded the policy in the way that we have done. As to whether it's desirable or not to expand those, our submission is it clearly is, because they are deliverable ways of meeting the need quickly. The management concerns can all be overcome. Nobody is saying, and Councillor Waters is not saying, there's any showstoppers in that regard.
Just for the avoidance of doubt in my mind, when you say expand or expansion, you're talking about within the existing site, aren't you?
That's what was being considered today, yes. So essentially utilising what is already within the council's land holding at those sites to deliver further pitches. And you've heard, for example, of the 2,500 square metres that's already been identified at the Clifton site.
Obviously, I ask that because expansion may or may not otherwise involve altering greenbelt boundaries. That's not the case here, though.
So no, we are not proposing any greenbelt boundary modifications as part of this policy, or to accommodate this policy is perhaps the best way of putting it.
Councillor Waters. Thank
you, sir. The statement there that deeply concerns me, talking about expanding within the site boundaries, if it concerns Osberwick, the only spare land available within the site boundary now, after it was expanded, is the field that was specifically set aside for grazing of horses. That was a particular requirement of the HCA funding in 2013 to alleviate a problem that had been seen all over the east side of York and actually made it into a parliamentary debate, and that was the number of accidents that were caused by tethered gypsy horses on the roadsides. So the spare land at Osberwick has got a specific required purpose. It is not available for expansion of extra pitches.
Mr. Hargreaves.
Oh, thank you, sir. I just wanted to, I mean, maybe we're nearly at the bottom of this. Mr. Jones, is it the, I understand that there's land at Clifton, yeah? Is it the case that the council is actively considering land adjoining or within the other two sites to identify the capacity for these 10 pitches?
No active work has been undertaken to look at the other two sites at this moment in time. We don't have the capacity. So as described before, the intention is to bring in a specific role that can assess the 3 sites.
Oh, okay. So am I right in saying that you have...
Hold on a minute, it's not cross-examination. If you put the question through the inspector, that's the appropriate way to deal with this.
I'm only... Sorry. Am I correct? Can I ask you through you that am I correct that there is no spare land at James Street?
So that you've heard that the work hasn't been undertaken on respect to that site. It will be done in due course by the Gypsy Traveller Officer. I don't really understand what the difficulty is here. We are told that there are not enough pitches available. The council is actively proposing to deal with that so far as it is able to do so. That surely must be something which is appropriate and capable of agreement around the room. I'd be very surprised if that's something that is not capable of agreement around the room today.
I suppose I'll just finally make a factual, well, not a factual point. I did have a look at the land adjacent to Clifton and felt you could achieve between 6 and 8 with some improvements to the site, maybe a maximum of 8 pitches. I know this is kind of counting, you know, angels on pinheads, but I think you would be pushed, in my view, having designed quite a lot of traveller sites, to get as much as 10 on the land adjacent to Clifton, just as a matter of fact. Could I mean, while I've got the microphone, could I come back on the references, I think, that were made, well, to the Vale of Aylesbury and the Guildford local plans, I think both of which I actually suggested to the council they should look at. Both are significantly different from, this is just a sort of, I wanted to just stress this, from the policy that's been adopted by the council in H5B. Vale of Aylesbury, as I understand it, proposes a single major site, which is a major urban extension to Aylesbury, which should accommodate a new traveller site. The Guildford local plan asks for contributions, but only for sites larger than 500 dwellings, which is very different from the kind of relatively small size of sites where York is asking for contributions. Now, if you look at the Guildford local plan, and maybe I'm getting into territories of improving plans, not making them sound, there's quite detailed consideration of site by site, and there's only 4 sites where they're asking for contributions. Guildford local plan, incidentally, has about 10 other traveller sites identified, unauthorised sites, extensions to existing gypsy sites. So it's a very different kettle of fish from York. The negotiated provision is on top of a base stream of allocations for traveller sites in Guildford. And for the 4 sites, major development sites, where they're asking for the provision of pitches, there's quite specific consideration in the site policies. It looks, in fact, there's one large site, well over 500 dwellings, where they're not asking for provision. Presumably they looked at the viability, they looked at the other issues they're trying to achieve on that site. And so there is a significant difference from what the City Council is trying to do. Guildford was looking in a very practical, grounded, site-by-site way. And therefore, it seems to me there's a much better grounded justification for those contributions than is the case in York.
Okay, well, it's quite interesting to hear about what's going on in my colleagues' other examinations. That said, I wonder, frankly, how instructive it is. I'm much more interested, Mr. Hargreaves, to know what you think about the policy that's proposed here, and including the main modification that the council's put forward. Do you say that aspect of the policy is unsound?
Yes. So, yeah.
Tell me why.
Okay, right. Tiny point, of course, H5A, I think you'll be pushed to get 10 on the existing sites. I think you can do it next to Clifton. I think there isn't any land at James Street. I think there are the kind of management issues that Councillor Waters has identified in regard to Osbaldwick. I think that then raises another issue. If the council's suggesting that from within its estate, it's possible to accommodate some pitches elsewhere, well, actually, this examination needs to know about that, given how the inadequacy or the non-existence of provision for gypsies and travellers within the submitted plan. So that's sort of a slight aside on H5A. In regard to H5B, I think Johnson Mowat for Redrow Homes put it well. It looks like finding a solution to the gypsy and traveller issue, which was too difficult for the council. And the idea of offloading it onto the housing sites was proposed without any idea of how it would work. In my view, it is very unlikely, it's at risk of being unsound. Or certainly, okay, there's 2 issues. Is it sound? And B, will it work? Let's take the will it work first. H5B represents a profound negotiation challenge, particularly in the shape it has now as modified. I don't accept Mr. Henderson's narrative about, the commuted payments were under the previous draft of the wording. I'm I believe very strongly that the council will not be successful in negotiating within site provision from the major housing developers. The simple reason is that given the very high level of prejudice there is against Gypsy people, house builders who are seeking to sell housing to would-be purchasers will be extremely reticent to provide any provision within the footprint of their site. I think we can confidentially say that. The whole record of achieving provision through private developments in local plans, the achievement level is almost non-existent because of the reticence of the developers, right? In the 7 counties of the east of England and Buckinghamshire, I'm not yet, with maybe one exception, I'm not aware of a single example where a site has been delivered in that way. Developers will just not accept that. And I understand from some kind of confidential research or research which doesn't name names, that it will make it very difficult for house builders to fund development if they're required to include a traveller site within the footprint. The other side of that is the huge problem, the corner York has painted itself into, of the very tight green belt it's promoting without any reserve land, white land. Developers will not be able to suggest alternative, or will find it extremely difficult to identify alternative land because of the extent of the green belt the council is promoting. If they could identify that, well, they wouldn't, because any developable land which is not green belt, which is not already allocated, and we've heard that effectively the council's allocated all the non-green belt land, will be very, very high value because of expectations of being able to develop that. So basically the policy will not work. I think I'm very confident in predicting that what will happen, the best the council will do will be to get commuted payments. But it hasn't got anywhere to put them because it has shied away from allocations and is seeking to put in place an inappropriately tight green belt which will either constrain York's development or will need to be reviewed very quickly, which is quite contrary to the MPPF guidance. I tend to disagree with Mr. Henderson. I mean, he's the barrister, but I think it is very likely. I mean, people may agree to certain things because they want to get a permission, yeah? Some developers agree to things, they'll sign up because they don't want to kind of go to an appeal, etc. But I think there is a very strong risk that provision in the way the council is seeking it can be argued to be not directly related to the development and not necessary to make it acceptable, which is exactly what the inspector in the ST ST2, I think it might, Boroughbridge Road site found. Maybe that's why they're not here because today, the developers, because they feel that they will have that card up their sleeve. So, in my submission, H5B is a chimera. It will not work. Now, it is true that I would say if it's only Clifton, probably max of 8 additional sites on Clifton will make a contribution. The council may well be, and as we've seen to some extent, it may well be successful in attracting a pot of Section 106 money. The only place it can put it will be Clifton. I think this idea of that it'll look at the estate that will create huge political problems. It's almost dishonest to this inquiry to not be coming up with specific sites. And it's something we have asked for repeatedly. To make this policy work, you need sites, and there aren't any. So although we disagree about the level of need, we say it's significantly more than 40. You just have nowhere to go because the council, for whatever reasons, backed away from having the courage to allocate the land. And now, if you had the willing developers and you had some allocations you could move the money onto, that would potentially work. You could say, well, we've got these potential for 8, maybe 10 pitches next to Clifton. I think we would say in response to that, that will only work for social rented sites. That land will not be attractive to the many gypsies who've been pushed out of the area or are lying low or are managing who would like to develop private sites near to York. And in a way, that kind of social-only provision, which perpetuates the weakness in your quite distinctive weakness. I know of nowhere else which has only got public sites almost and has not succeeded in granting any effective private provisions. York is quite unique and quite distinctive and quite different in that way. Planning policy, government policy is very clear that while there will be a proportion of people who will still need social provision, the main provision is to be made by private sites. Planning policy for traveller sites, paragraph 4E. It's what gypsy people want. It's also likely to be cheaper to develop, because if you're developing social provision, effectively you're going to have to build the whole thing. In regard to private sites, one can envisage a model where you get land, you put in basic services, water, sewage, fencing, access into the site, and there will be, a long queue of travellers if you offered sites like that in relatively small groupings away from the city. So there needs to be sites allocated, not in the green belt, that will meet them, that would enable you to operationalise H5B in a way different and not exclusively for social rented sites. Finally, H5C is also a chimera because you won't be able to identify any sites that meet its criteria because of what you're doing with the green belt and the fundamental conflict between the inappropriateness of gypsy and traveller development and the green belt.
Yeah, I'm going to take a break now. I make it sort of if I say 1:45, does that work for everyone?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I make it then 13:07. I'll adjourn the hearing to resume at 13:45. Thank you.